Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a fascinating, almost mind-bending historical mystery. We're looking at the paradox of King Abijah, one man with two completely different legacies. It's an incredible story from an ancient text about a ruler whose entire life shifts dramatically depending on the lens of the historian telling it.
Let me ask you something right out of the gate. It's a profound question straight from our source material that really forces us to think about our own ultimate legacy. When the dust finally settles and your life becomes history, how will you be remembered? The source text poses this through a theological lens, asking how God will remember our lives when they're over. It's a heavy question for sure, but it's exactly what our historical subject today, King Abijah, forces us to confront.
So let's jump right into Section 1, The Paradox, a tale of two records.
Ancient texts don't always agree, and in this specific case, the contradiction is an absolute historical scandal. Our source text points out that in the record of 1 Kings, where he's called Abijam, his life is brutally dismissed in just 8 short verses. He's described as a sinful man whose heart was just not wholly true to God. He is practically written off. But then, you turn over to 2 Chronicles, there he's called Abijah, and he gets an expansive, triumphant 22 verses where he is entirely celebrated as a faithful hero who completely relies on God during a massive crisis.
So here's the million-dollar question. How on earth can 2 historical records look at the exact same man and draw completely opposite conclusions? Are these texts contradicting each other? Are they somehow talking about different people? Well, the source material tells us this isn't just a typo, it's actually a deliberate framing by 2 different authors writing for 2 completely different audiences.
To figure out why, let's move to Section 2, Solving the Historical Mystery.
It turns out it's all about context. The authors were writing in completely different eras, driven by entirely different existential questions. The Book of Kings was written during the Babylonian exile. The nation had literally been destroyed, and the people were desperately asking, why did we fall? So, the author used a very strict metric of judgment to explain that tragedy. But Chronicles? That was written generations later, post-exile. The people had finally returned to a ruined land, and their key question was, is there hope? They really didn't need more judgment. They needed to see that God hadn't given up on them.
And here is the absolute kicker. Both of these accounts are entirely true. They just capture different realities of the exact same imperfect man. The source material argues that these records are not mutually exclusive. Abijah was, indeed, a deeply flawed, sinful man, just like Kings recorded. But as Chronicles recorded, he was also a man who, in one incredibly desperate moment, threw his entire weight onto his reliance on God. This brings us to Section 3, and the climax of our story, the Battle of Mount Zemaraim. King Abijah of Judah was facing a literally impossible situation. He marches into the battlefield with 400,000 soldiers, which sounds like a lot, right? But his enemy, King Jeroboam of the northern kingdom of Israel, brings 800,000 soldiers. Judah is looking at impossible, 2-to-1 odds against a massive enemy army. Mathematically, strategically, logically, this is an unwinnable fight. So what does he do? Instead of drawing his sword or retreating in a total panic, Abijah steps up to preach. He actually climbs Mount Zemaraim and delivers this profound plea to the massive enemy force. He focuses his defense on 2 fundamental steps of faith, as outlined by our source. First, he appeals to the eternal salt covenant made with David, and second, he highlights the purity of their Aaronic worship, completely contrasting it against the golden calves and false idols of the northern kingdom.
Now, I really want to pause on that first point because it's absolutely crucial. He specifically invokes a salt covenant. You see, in the ancient world, salt was a preservative. A salt covenant represents an eternal, unchanging, and incorruptible promise. Abijah is completely stripping away his own merit here. He's relying entirely on an ancient, unbreakable promise from God rather than his own military might or his own personal righteousness.
Right in the face of absolute destruction, he looks at an army twice his size and makes this astonishing declaration. God himself is with us as our head. Do not fight against the Lord, the God of your ancestors, for you will not succeed. Coming from a man that another historical book called completely flawed, this is just an incredible display of faith.
But of course, the enemy doesn't just pack up and go home. Let's look at Section 4, Ambush and Deliverance. Because while Abijah is delivering this incredible sermon, King Jeroboam is maneuvering. The northern kingdom sets a devastating trap. They send troops all the way around the back, completely surrounding Judah. Now, Abijah's 400,000 men are ambushed from the front and ambushed from the rear. They are entirely trapped in a pincer movement against 800,000 men. Humanly speaking,
It's over.
But here's the thing. In this utterly hopeless moment, they don't panic. There's nowhere to run anyway. Instead, they cry out. The priests blow the trumpets, signaling their total reliance on the divine. And according to the source text, God himself strikes down that massive enemy force. The text explicitly notes that it wasn't Judah's tactical brilliance that won the day. It was their sheer reliance on God when they were surrounded on all sides.
So how do we wrap our heads around this? That brings us to our final section, Section 5, Justice, Grace, and the Covenant. The source text presents its really brilliant dual nature of God to bring these two vastly different records together. On one hand, you have a God of strict justice who doesn't just sweep the reality of sin under the rug, which is exactly what we see in the book of 1 Kings. But on the other hand, you have a God of immense grace who honors our desperate reliance on him, even when it comes from a deeply flawed person. And that is the beautiful message of 2 Chronicles.
And the source actually concludes that this whole theological paradox is ultimately resolved in Jesus Christ. According to the text, Jesus perfectly bridges the gap between that justice and grace. Because he was completely without flaw, the text asserts that he absorbed the strict, unyielding judgment we see in 1 Kings, which then allows humanity to freely receive the profound grace we see in 2 Chronicles. It's a fascinating way to unify these two very different historical lenses.
Now, I want to bring this directly back to you with a critical question for when you face impossible ambushes today. You might not be staring down 800,000 enemy soldiers, but life really has a way of surrounding us from the front and the back, doesn't it? Whether it's an ambush in your health, crazy tension in your family, or massive pressure at work, when the odds are 2-to-1 against you, will you rely on your own strength and just try to calculate the odds? Or will you cry out?
The absolute ultimate takeaway from this explainer is that your deliverance doesn't require your absolute perfection. If King Abijah proves anything, it's that you can be highly flawed and still experience profound victory. It simply requires you to cry out and rely on a greater, unchanging promise when you are completely surrounded. So if history remembers us for our weakest moments, but grace defines us by our reliance, which legacy are you building today?